It can use one data center, one of the larger data centers can use 5 million gallons of water per day, which is about the amount of water that you'd have for a city of, say, 50,000 people or so. And this has to be fresh water. A lot of this water evaporates. So, it goes through the data centers and then it's evaporating as it's gaining the heat. So it's not really returned to be consumed by the public. So it's not just the electrical power, but it's also the water consumption. So it has a huge footprint for climate.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Climate Emergency Forum. I'm Herb Simmens, author of A Climate Vocabulary of the Future, and I will be your host today. If we were recording this a few years ago and we said that the topic of the program is data centers, everybody would probably yawn and change the channel to the latest Kim Kardashian news or whatever. But we're in the world of 2026, and data centers are on the minds of many, many people, and for lots of reasons, lots of concerns in the United States, but everywhere, really, because data is everywhere. Data is exploding everywhere. And that's the topic of today. We'll be looking at data centers, and it's, of course, like with everything we do, its connection to the climate emergency. And as always, I am so happy to have with us Dr. Peter Carter. Peter, you live in British Columbia. You're a retired medical doctor. You're the founder of the Climate Emergency Institute, and you have been a reviewer for the IPCC. We also have with us Paul Beckwith. I want to make sure that everyone likes, subscribes to the channel, goes to our website, climateemergencyforum.org. If you could donate, we would really appreciate your support. Leave us your comments, your suggestions for future programs. As always, we hope you will stay to the end of this program when I will be very briefly, in 3 minutes or less, talking about the three of the most important climate stories of the past week. So with that, let me turn it over to Peter. Peter, why do we even need a program on data centers? Why is this important right now? And tell us more about the background.
Well, we are rapidly being transformed into a world of artificial intelligence, right? So all of the publicity on data centers, of course, and very reasonably all of the interest is on artificial intelligence. Now, I must say that it's not many years ago when I first read and heard the word artificial intelligence, and I thought, oh, this is just a joke, right? well, it's no joke because it's happening faster than anything that has ever happened in the experience of civilization humanity. I mean, to say it's dramatic is a huge understatement. So, AI, the reason why I sort of thought it was a joke was that, we're human beings are very proud of the fact that we're called Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens sapiens, the wisest of the wise, right? So launching into artificial intelligence, right, as an alternative to our own intelligence would seem to be very, very, very risky. But there's no going back. There's no going back on AI, that's for sure. AI increases everything. It's going to increase the world economy and local economies and cities. And I don't think that's a terribly good thing because when we see economic growth increase, we see more carbon emissions. But everything is going to be increased exponentially. So we're talking about rates of growth on the technology, on the construction, on the effects of AI training, and particularly, of course, interesting to us on the increase in CO2. So yeah, everything's going up exponentially. I want to give a little bit of background of what I work on, what I'm interested in, because you really do have to put this into perspective. And so emissions are going to increase. Carbon dioxide emissions will increase. Methane emissions will increase because a great deal of the energy being used is going to be natural gas, which is mainly methane. And also water problems, water stress and insecurity, that's going to be increased. So I'll start talking about CO2 emissions, okay? So CO2 emissions are records every year, with the exception of the COVID and the big bankruptcy thing with the banks. Every year has been a record year for CO2 emissions. And in fact, just a couple of years ago, we had a record on CO2 emissions. We're now at 38 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. They've increased practically 70% since 1990. 1990 is no time at all, no time at all. 70% increase in carbon dioxide emissions. And carbon dioxide emissions were very sensibly years ago called that CO2 is forever by the carbon cycle expert in Chicago, David Archer. I thought it was because on average, CO2 lasts for hundreds of years. So it sort of never goes away in that sense. Atmospheric carbon dioxide has never, ever increased as fast as it is now. And I must give you some numbers on that. We're now at 428 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And that's a 53% increase on 1800, on pre-industrial. We're seeing it increase, ratcheting up 1% very, very, very fast. So it's only a couple of years ago, it was 52, and it was only a couple of years before that, it was 51. Because I watched this, and it's stunning. It is stunning how fast atmospheric carbon dioxide is going up. So I'm going to quickly refer back then to the fact, the definite fact, that increase in data centers and increase in AI is going to increase carbon dioxide emissions. And that is going to increase atmospheric carbon dioxide even more. How fast is CO2 going up? Well, the scientists, and they do absolutely incredible work on this, they say it is 100 to 200 times faster than what normally happens, the global warming that normally happens to end an ice age. 200 times faster. But the IPCC last assessment said that in actual fact, the rate is several times faster than anything that the paleoclimate scientists can find in the past 45 million years. So the rate of CO2 increases absolutely stunning, stunning. So on to try and get some reasonable information on AI, because the information actually is all over the place, you know. There are some research that says, oh, don't worry, actually AI is going to reduce CO2 emissions. So, well, that's really impossible. It's totally impossible in the short term. Everybody accepts that. So to quote the people that really know best on what's going to happen, I found myself with Goldman Sachs, and their data says that data center demand due to AI largely is going to grow about 50% in just to 2027. But this is what the number that's really stunning. This is going to be a compound annual growth rate of 17% from 2025 to 2028. This kind of growth, nothing's come even close to this in our history. I'm sure I'm not a historian, but this is unique, I'm sure.
Thanks, Peter. That is a very sobering statistics you presented to us, which seems to be a role you play regularly on this channel, is presenting the unvarnished truth, however grim it may sound. With that, I'm happy, as always, to turn to Paul and give us your perspective on this sort of emerging phenomena of data centers and AI.
Thank you, Herb, and thanks, Peter. This is a fascinating session. Of course, people are aware of data centers and the growth of data centers. You know, if you're not that familiar, it's basically room after room in a huge warehouse, rows and stacks of servers, routers, switches. We're seeing more and more data centers that are specifically for AI. So the hardware is basically trying to simulate the human brain where we have these NVIDIA type, they call them GPUs, which stands for graphical processing units. And they've spun off from the graphics cards that you used to slot into your PC a couple decades ago. And they've become much more sophisticated and they act as the neurons of the artificial brain, if you like. And all of these nodes are connected by fiber optic cables, high-speed cables. So one node connected to many other nodes to try to simulate the way the brain functions to create the sophisticated AI. But in terms of the environmental footprint, it's getting larger and larger. So there's been huge growth in the number of these data centers. The latest numbers I saw were something like almost 5,500 data centers a couple of years ago, and they consume in 2022, 2023, they consumed 17 gigawatts of power, or about 4.4% of the US electrical consumption. Now, a large nuclear plant might be a gigawatt. We've got a couple in Canada. I think Bruce nuclear plant produces a few gigawatts, and they're hoping to double that capacity. If you combine all of the energy of these servers, it's about the equivalent of the total electrical grid of Ireland. 56% of the electricity to power these data centers in the US is from fossil fuels, specifically natural gas. By 2030, they're expecting to increase. So a few years ago we were at 17 gigawatts. They're hoping to be at about 130 gigawatts by 2030. So this is huge, explosive growth. And I mentioned mostly it's from fossil fuel energy sources to power these. It's not just to run the computers and the chips and all the electronics, but it's also to provide cooling because there's a huge amount of heat that is produced in these data centers, and that heat has to be extracted. So it's done generally by water-cooled systems. About 22% of the servers are power consumption is by renewables and about 21% by nuclear power. And if we get to that 130 gigawatt in 2030, that'll be about 12% of US demand. And, if you go back in 2018, we only had about 1,000 of these data centers. And a few years ago, we were up to already 5,500 or so. So we're talking about huge growth in all of these systems. And, that has an enormous environmental footprint. It can use one data center, one of the larger data centers, can use 5 million gallons of water per day, which is about the amount of water that you'd have for a city of, say, 50,000 people or so. And this has to be fresh water. A lot of this water evaporates. So, it goes through the data centers and then it's evaporating as it's gaining the heat. So it's not really returned to be consumed by the public. So it's not just the electrical power, but it's also the water consumption. So it has a huge footprint for climate. So just recently, you've probably heard some noise from people like Elon Musk saying, hey, let's put these data centers up into space, into low Earth orbit. For one thing, it's colder up there, so you can do the cooling. A lot of the electrical consumption is for actual cooling. About a third or so is for the cooling. So the coldness of space could do the cooling, and you could power them by solar energy up in space.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate those comments. I want to now go back to Peter and ask a question. There are lots of people who, primarily supporters of AI, not surprisingly perhaps, and supporters of the growth of data centers, who make what sounds like a plausible argument that whatever additional electricity and natural gas, etc., data centers may generate, that AI can revolutionize action on climate change in every endeavor by doing much of the scientific work, by making energy processes dramatically more efficient, by providing critical information to decision makers instantaneously, to analyzing optimal ways to achieve emission reductions, and so much more. What would your response be to that assertion?
Well, I agree. I read a lot of that, and I get the impression that a lot of it is promotional. I mean, this is a massive business. It's actually the biggest business in terms of trillions of dollars, also, that I think that's ever happened. And they make a very good argument, no question about that. They do. However, it defies the science. CO2 will go up. We read about green data centers, we read about sustainable AI, right? It is an entire new level of technology and an entire new increase in energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions on top of what's going on today. The reality of the science is that, according to the IPCC, to limit to 2 degrees C, which is catastrophic, let alone 1.5 degrees C, the IPCC has been saying for years and years and years the global emissions had to be put into decline by 2020 at the very latest. So the last assessment, the AR6, well, 2020 to 2025 at the very latest. So we're over that already, right? So in order to avoid total catastrophic climate change, the fact of the science is that our emissions have to go down very soon and very fast.
But you've said, if I could, sort of bring up something you said at one of our previous programs where you said the science really is not the name of the game now. It's behavior change, it's lifestyle change, and so forth. So if you were magically transported for a day to be the policy advisor for the Canadian Prime Minister or the
Mhm.
Prime Minister of British Columbia, and he said, Peter, for decades, you have been as passionate and as knowledgeable as anybody on science. What should I do, given my authority, limited or not limited, to address the issue of data centers? What might you tell him?
Well, the problem and the solution lies in economics. It lies in our economics. So the leader of British Columbia and also our new leader of Canada, Mr. Carney, who is one of the most knowledgeable people and on climate change. For years and years and years, as the chief bank superintendent, he was traveling
Mhm.
internationally and advising people about climate change. But once you get in a position of political leadership, you're actually owned by the economy and your decision is made by the economics.
What would you tell him?
Change the economics.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there for now. It's like James Carville in the United States when Clinton was running, saying the slogan is, it's the economy, stupid. Peter Carter's mantra will be change the economics. So this is a warning to Mark Carney and whoever else is running Canada or the provinces. Listen to Peter as he says, change the economics. Let me turn it back to Paul for any comments you might have to make.
There are advantages of putting these up in space, but they'd have to be very reliable before they were put up there because you can't very well go up and service them. In low Earth orbit, they would have a short lifetime. They would have booster rockets on them to put them up into higher orbit and maintain their orbit, but the lifetime of the Starlink satellites constellation in the constellation for internet access is about 5 years. And there is another really huge problem, which will probably make such schemes impossible to implement because we're loading up low Earth orbit with more and more satellites. So if there was an unexpected inability to maneuver these satellites to avoid collisions, a collision would probably occur within the latest is 3.8 days. You'd get a collision with high probability. And if you get one collision, then you can get a cascading production of debris, which would then cause more collisions and more collisions. And eventually it could close down low Earth orbit to any launches at all into space. So the idea of putting huge data centers up in space is very problematic for that main reason. And this phenomenon is called the Kessler syndrome. I've done numerous videos on it, but it's a huge risk to putting anything in low Earth orbit. So as our world, has more and more requirements for computing in AI, for storing data, for, live streaming, our whole society is powered by these digital devices. So the demand is only going to keep growing, but we do run up against the limitations, resource limitations. I mean, we can try to make things more efficient, but also, we've seen a large increase in the last few years of prices for electricity, especially in the US. So electricity prices have been twice the inflation rate in the US in the last couple of years. We've seen massive power outages. The electrical grid is a bit rickety and a bit shaky and a bit problematic, especially in the US, southern states. So when we get a massive storm going through, it can knock out power. We saw this recently. A large storm went across and we lost power to almost like 500,000 residences and businesses. If there's an average 3 people living per residence, that's about 1.5 million people. And 2 weeks after that storm, there were still about 50,000 odd people without electricity. They'd been without electricity for 2 weeks. So the electricity supply is being prioritized to data centers. So the data centers in the States where many, many residences lost their electricity, the power was restored to the data centers before it was restored to the general public. So this is another problem, where our priorities lie. So the footprint, anyway, like the expansion of these data centers is projected to be phenomenal. We're going to get large, nonlinear, exponential growth in the numbers of data centers, in their sophistication, because the more and more nodes that we can put in a data center in terms of the AI case, the more advanced we expect the AI to be. So it's a function, the power of an AI is a function of the number of different neurons or nodes in the brain, and then the number of connections between them and the speed of the connections between them. So, and then you can get emergent properties of what we think of artificial general intelligence and so on that can appear when you cross a threshold. So we're heading there rapidly. There's more and more money being put in it. It's driving 80% of stock market gains is AI. The demands on resources and the effects on worsening climate are very, very significant, and we have to consider how we deal with this. Within the last month, Elon Musk has combined SpaceX with his AI company, XAI. And their objective, he's actually given some hints of their plan for AI data centers in the future. And what they talked about is the combined company, SpaceX and XAI, they've applied to the FCC regulatory bodies in the US to get something like 1 million satellites up in space to run these data center servers up in space. And it's in low Earth orbit for the most part. Right now, we're talking about something like 10,000 Starlink satellites with plans to go up to 30,000. So there's huge plans in the works to move these centers up into space. And I said there's huge advantages, like if they run off solar power, if they get cooling because it's cold up in space, those are fantastic advantages. But the big, huge disadvantage is the crowding of orbit and the potential for cascading collisions, which could literally close low Earth orbit, not just to satellites, but to NASA space launches, any moon missions, any Mars missions. I mean, it could reach a point where we actually can't launch anything or anybody up into space for several decades if we get these cascading collisions occurring.
Thanks, Paul. With that, let me ask you, Peter, give us some wrap-up thoughts on this challenging question of data centers and AI.
As somebody who has had a lot of experience with policy making, regulation, environmental assessments, the big thing, which is to me very noticeably lacking, is that AI is being brought in, approved, and licensed in a manner that an industry has never had before. It decides to get a hold of some land, and it gets a hold of land. There's no regulations on it. In at least one case that I know, if the public doesn't like it, the company, the corporation that's going to put in the AI sues them and gets the land. So this is awful to me because environmental sustainability, environmental safety, a safe climate completely depends on our governance. It depends mostly, actually, on regulation. This is how our society works, right? At all levels. But suddenly, we have the most massive change and massive influence on all aspects of our life, which is data centers and AI. And everything is being approved and gone through with no examination at all, no public input, no input from experts like I used to do years ago, nothing. And they are huge. I'm sure you've seen the size of these data centers. They're going up in the United States more than anywhere else on the world. And as was mentioned in our last program, the present Republican administration is very proud of the fact that it's deregulating everything. Its aim is deregulation. I mean, it says so.
Yeah, well put.
So that would be my last word on it. That's what I'm really, really annoyed about, frankly.
Yeah, with good reason. So I want to thank Peter and Paul as always, and just to remind us of the scale. I mean, as you've alluded to, Peter, it's remarkable. There's one facility being built in the south that apparently, when fully operational, will use as much power as the entire city of New Orleans. The amount of water that's used, and it's not water that gets recycled, it's water that gets evaporated. So where I live in northern Maryland, next to Washington, D.C., is just across the river from Northern Virginia, where two-thirds of the world's data travels through Northern Virginia on its way to and from the world. And there are literally hundreds of data centers there. They take water out of the Potomac River and so forth, and then it just disappears. These environmental local consequences are exceedingly challenging, as well as the climate consequences we've discussed. And this larger question that I'm sure we and everyone else will be talking about what kind of world are we going to have that is dominated by AI in the coming years. So with that, I want to thank our viewers for joining us as always, your loyalty, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much.